Alright. Hi everyone. Just gonna do this. And view float on top. Excellent. Hi, long time no film. Sorry, it's been a few weeks of illness. And a lot of teaching. So I've not been able to do what I like to do, among other things, on the weekend, which is record a film for you about a subject of literature and how to read literature. In particular, today we're going to talk about, and I'm going to try and make this more bite-sized because I feel like 40-minute videos are crazy to ask you to listen to, and that I've asked you to listen to hour-long videos, and that's just beyond the pale, and I hope you do chop them up. So we're going to try and do a 10-minute video, starting now. So I want to talk about 4 moves when you talk about gender and women more generally, which, if you're dealing with Romeo and Juliet, it's going to be hard not to deal with women on some level, unless you're doing violence, and even then, women have a specific role with regards to violence, and it is just, if you're doing Wordsworth, that's one of the main themes, is how he deals with the question of femininity and the women of his life. And just generally speaking, it's a good, club to have in your golf bat, in your golf rack, because, and you know my sports metaphors always fail miserably, because across different kinds of disciplines, if you're studying psychology, if you're studying sociology, if you're studying philosophy, definitely if you're ever doing any gender studies, it will be useful to see some moves for how to analyze gender. So this kind of applies both to how you think about literature and, on a deeper level, how you think about gender relationships when you encounter them, when a man or a woman treats you a certain way, and you feel that your gender, it has something to do with it. It often does. Very often does. The gap between how women and men think in terms of political views has grown over the last 30 years considerably, so that now it's about at the highest level. It's around 30 percentage points, at least in America, between how women vote and how men vote, which is extraordinary to me. Alright, so, without further ado, how to read literature thinking about gender. What are the moves that feminist critics make to read literature with gender? And the first one is, so there are 4 principles. One is looking at location. A little bit of a rip-off from real estate. The general idea is, where is the woman placed? Which, when you think about feminist criticism, there is a basic way in which women are dependent on location. They're often put in the home. In the home, you are much more literally enclosed, and your range is much smaller, and that's a big part of social injustice, is just the concept that women should stay at home while men can go around. So, location in that sense. Location in the sense of staging, or in a poem, location of when do you appear in the poem. If a woman, as often happens in a Wordsworth poem, appears after 105 lines, and she's suddenly the subject of the poem, but she hasn't been in the poem at all for 100 lines, then that location is suspicious, and it suggests that Wordsworth is marginalizing the female voice by putting her in this weird location. In Romeo and Juliet, you can do the other side of that, which is by putting Juliet up on the balcony, you kind of have her work above Romeo on some level. And then when they're both on the balcony, it's kind of an egalitarian and equal rights relationship. But at the same time, you can talk about how the staging never really places Juliet on the street, and that really shows her limitations as a character. Romeo can go around everywhere. Juliet, even when she does go outside once, not to her grave, has to use false pretense and a whole plot. And she goes to literally a friar's cell. She goes to an even more enclosed space. So locations are really important to show the relationship between men and women. Number 2, voice, which is just how often do women talk. And when they talk, are they talking about things that men have already said, like Lady Capulet repeating Paris's argument that younger women are already mothers? Or are they talking about their own issue? Are they offering their own perspective, or are they just a mouthpiece for another's perspective? Which you can kind of see in a lot of ways. You can see it in the repetition. You can see it of female characters of what male characters say, but you can also see it in Wordsworth in those places where he imagines the female voice, but it's really just his voice, and he doesn't even invest too much effort in making his language all that different from the language of the female character. And that goes to the whole conversation we had about appropriation, about taking over the female voice in A-level. But regardless, if a woman has 3 lines, and we can kind of see that whenever Juliet is sort of out of power, she gets shouted down, she gets talked down to, and literally, at some point, Capulet says to her, enough of the talking. Enough. Not so much for you with the talking. So, very much oppression comes in the form of the quantity of lines, and who has more to say. And when you think about the Elizabethan stage, this has an interesting little trick, because if a woman was played not so much by a man as by a young boy, then she would, just by virtue of the stage, and they didn't even necessarily mean it that way, but by virtue of the stage, female roles had to be a little different, because it was riskier to give a big role to a child than it is to a man, to a grown human being. If you think about, if you have a stage with a bunch of 18, 20, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and you have a 13-year-old boy whose voice is just broken, are you going to give them a huge role? And when you do, that is already like a big challenge for that child actor. So from that perspective, you can see why Juliet often has fewer lines, though she has a lot of lines in this play, and a fair amount of Shakespeare's female characters have a lot of lines, but a lot of female characters are also defined by their silence, and Juliet, in many important scenes, is much quieter than her counterpart. And when you think about the monologue as well, it is a way for Shakespeare to give Juliet a voice. The soliloquy, the idea of a character talking to himself, which is usually a tool for sharing the thoughts of the character with the audience. Shakespeare realizes, you know what, I have a female character, she's not going to be able to talk too much to other characters. Let's use the fact that we need to express her thoughts anyway in a soliloquy, or we can express them in a soliloquy, to have her say a bunch of things that she wouldn't say otherwise, because she's not allowed to speak very much. Alright, I'll skip to the third, because I feel like the third is the most advanced and most sophisticated, and I'll skip it to the fourth, which is a feminist critic will often, after they've noted that a woman is saying what a man would have her say, and that her language isn't her own, and that she has fewer lines in the poem or in the play, or even in the novel, fewer pages. And after noting how her location diminishes her power, often, or raises her power, rarely, the next move is for the feminist critic to notice the hidden sexuality of language and metaphors, and kind of think about how a woman is basically, one of the students in year 11 said the other day, made to please. How a woman is conceptualized as made to please, is thought of as made to please. And part of that is in the hidden sexuality of kind of male sexuality as this aggressive, violent, penetrating symbols like swords, like worms, like daggers, etc. And women as kind of, again, as containers. Women as containers. So if you think about like what caves and the sea and the book's cover have in common, it's partly this idea of, in sexuality, women are kind of wrapping themselves around the man. And if you think about in like those images, not in reality, but in those images, and if you think about what that does to gender relations, the fact that the woman covers the man, it means that he is the main thing that needs to be protected, and she is kind of there to shield him from all sorts of influences. So very often she is serving a role for him, whilst he gets to do all the meaningful things. And that's in the sexual imagery, where, yeah, there's less of an active role, there's less of an important role for the female than there is for the male, I would say. It's a fairly easy way to read sexual metaphors. And the important thing about reading metaphors sexually is you're always doing something with the text. So the greatest fear is that we just read a sword as a sword, and we just talk about how they're violent because they use swords. The reader knows that they're violent because they use swords. But if you then talk about the aggressive male sexuality of the naked sword, then you're already doing something. You're turning from sword to sexual aggression, and that's a much better move. That's you doing something with the text. Very often, literary critics of Wordsworth would just love reading his various moves with oars into the ocean, with, like, a little basket grabbing nuts. Again, just all sorts of, like, hooks, various hooks, and other hunting instruments, and just read the sexual violence of Wordsworth towards nature in those images. Because again, seeing the images as like symbolic versions of male aggression is a big part of how you see male power and how you see the dominance the male dominance that is at the heart of what we call the patriarchy, the rule of man over woman. It often works on the level of symbols. It's really important. And then we come to the last one. I feel like this video has been a lot quicker, which is what I was hoping for. Come to the last move, which is one of my all-time favorite moves. And I still often forget to do it because it's a tricky one. Because you're not supposed to see absence. I'll just mark it for a moment. I'll bold it because it's such a great move. And that is talking about what isn't there in the text. So, in the essay I had you read from Feminism, it was about how in the Lucy poems there isn't actually the voice of Lucy. We don't actually get to hear her talk. Then, when we did have women who got to talk, it was never a healthy woman. Never a woman who could move. So all of those things were out of the way for them to talk about. Then there was like a completely great, just pure absence move, which was Wordsworth never talks about toys. Never ever talks about toys. Just like, this isn't there. This isn't there. And what's amazing about this move is you so easily see what is somewhere, and very often the meaning is in what is not said. So if you're in a relationship and after a year no one has said I love you, that absence is actually going to be more meaningful in some ways than all the things that have been said and done. Like, that absence will start weighing on you. And very often I feel like people do say that rather quickly because they want to avoid that absence, which starts to loom. People start looking for that absence. And in Romeo and Juliet, we mentioned one absence, which is Juliet kind of moving freely. Another absence, Juliet never gets to have a group, never gets to have friends, really. Like, Romeo has Mercutio and Benvolio, and depending on how you read the play, servants and, his men that he gets to hang out with, his merry men. And Juliet has the nurse, who is, again, professionally there, not like a social interaction, and she has Lady Capulet, who we know is fairly distant, and has to be distant in her formal role as the mother in a patriarchy. Or if she doesn't have to, it's traditional for her to be. So those absences, and if I'm thinking about Wordsworth and what his absences are, I think it is conspicuous that it's really absent for nature to be stormy in Wordsworth. There's all sorts of stormy weather in literature, not so much in Wordsworth. Not so much. Nature is much calmer. And again, when we do see a storm, it is very particular to nature around the city. So again, nature by itself, the lake, doesn't get that bad. So just seeing that you can analyze absences is a really, really good way of thinking, okay, you know what, the limits that are placed on women isn't so much often in what I can see them saying, but in the fact that I never see them saying all these other things that I would expect them to say. Like, we never actually get to see Juliet tell her dad off. Like, we never get her to say, I can't, it's my own thing, and I'll do my own thing, and I don't care what you think. Like, those scenes of teenage rebellion, like, I hate you, and I hate everything you stand for. Juliet doesn't come anywhere near that. Like, her act of defiance is so complex, and it's a little bit like Lady Macbeth talking about murder. She tries to talk around it as much as possible. So, just the absence of actual literal defiance really accentuates the fact that even though she just says, like, I can't do it, that's enough to create a whole sequence of chaos in this play. Whereas, I actually think in modern times, if we saw Juliet's way of expressing her desire, we would say, why is this child so meek and so unable to express her own views without all these words around, circumlocutions, words around words. Okay, so those are 4 moves you would make as a feminist critic. And I believe that's the video. You would look at where women are, you would look at how much voice they have, independence-wise, quantity of lines-wise. You would look at the hidden sexuality of the images, like the sea, like the cover of the book. And you would look for what they don't say and what they can't do, or we never see them say or do, which is kind of a similar principle. Alright, thank you so much for listening.